tonight. The gentleman speaking, he may be eccentric, but he is wearing the true Viking outfit here for our benefit. You'll see, giving us a little bit of culture here. I asked him if he had taken a DNA test. He has. He's about 75% Scandinavian, and the other 25% basically Northern Europe, right? So he is what he is, right? And he's here to speak to us about the Vikings. I want to say thank you to the Center for Religion and Politics, and Dr. Evans, and also the School of Theology and Missions for co-hosting this event. As you know, Lars Walker will be speaking with us about when Christianity came to the Vikings. He has written a number of excellent books. I was going to hold them up, but I don't have my hand at the moment. Mostly historical fiction about the time of the Vikings, of the period where Christianity intersects with the Vikings in their lives together. There are some tremendous lessons there, I think, about the interaction between religion and politics, and about some of the pitfalls of coercing people when it comes to religion. So some wonderful stuff, and of course, done through story in a way that reaches through to your heart. But he has written a number of novels, most of them historical, a few of them set in the present day, or even in the early 20th century. And I have read all of them, except for the most recent. I'm a Lars Walker fanboy, and I have infected a few other people with the virus as well. So I am just very pleased to welcome Lars. Lars, if you would come join me to speak to us about Christianity and the Vikings. Let's give him a welcome.
Thank you so much for welcoming me here. It has just been a delightful, there we go. It has just been a delightful day, and I could not be more grateful for the gracious reception I have received. My belly is full of meat like a proper Viking scald, and go ahead with what I have to say, and I hope this is of some interest, not just to people who are interested in Vikings or Scandinavian, my heritage, but I think there's some universal application here. Talking about, oh yes, I need to use this thing. And I think it's ready to go. There we go. Norse mythology. Some of you are I'm sure some of you are familiar with this literary passage. Instantly I was uplifted. There we go. Instantly I was uplifted into huge regions of northern sky. I desired with almost sickening intensity something never to be described except that it is cold, spacious, severe, pale, and remote. A line from C.S. Lewis's Surprised by Joy, in which he talks about the ecstasy with which he first encountered Norse mythology as a boy, along with the music of Wagner. And then he goes on to tell how pursuing that passion, that joy, as he called it, actually led him on a journey that finally brought him to Jesus Christ and the cross. I wish that were a universal experience. I wish I could say that happens a lot. Unfortunately, it seems to me, at least in our time, it often goes the very other way. I am a Viking reenactor, and as you can see from what I'm wearing. And in that hobby, I encounter a lot of people who call themselves heathen. Heathen is their preferred term. They worship the old gods, Odin and Thor. And if you ask them why, and usually you don't have to ask them why, they'll be happy to tell you without your asking. They will usually say, well, one of the reasons they will say is, well, my ancestors were forced to be baptized at sword point by those cruel Christians. Well, I believe the story is more complicated than that, and they are operating under a number of illusions, as I will go on to discuss. In fact, even in terms of I believe they're misinformed about the conversion. I also believe they're actually misinformed about what they believe. In fact, we know a whole lot less than a lot of people think we do about the Old Norse religion. What we have, they don't want to know this, but it's the truth. They have it because of Christians. There's a wonderful line from G.K. Chesterton's poem, The Ballad of the White Horse, where King Alfred the Great is addressing the chieftains of the Danish army, and he says to them, "For this your doom is upon you and your kings, not for fire and Ely fen, not that your gods are 9 or 10, but because it is only Christian men guard even heathen things." I see someone back there knows this poem. That's great. Chesterton is great, and it's a great poem. They owe what they know about the old religion, ironically, to a Christian. And this is the man, Snorri Sturluson. He was an Icelandic chieftain. He was a politician. He was a somewhat slimy politician, in fact. He was devious. He was sometimes treacherous. He may have been a traitor to his country. He was almost certainly a physical coward. And yet he was a literary genius. Forget it. Okay. Tom Shippey, who succeeded J.R.R. Tolkien as at Oxford University, calls Snorri Sturluson the most influential author of the Middle Ages. He wrote a book, among his many books, called the Prose Edda. The Prose Edda is a collection, is a narrative about the Old Norse religion, the gods, their origins, their stories, and the arc of their epic to the day of Ragnarok, and you're probably familiar with Ragnarok. The reason he did that, he was able to convince the churchmen of Iceland that they needed to preserve the knowledge of the old religion for the sake of Norse poetry. Norse poetry depended heavily on metaphors, complex metaphors called kennings. And the kennings could not be understood if you didn't understand the old myths. And he persuaded the church in Iceland, we have to preserve the old myths for the sake of our traditional poetry. But that means that what we have is a version of the old religion that was acceptable to the Icelandic church. We don't actually know for sure. They didn't have any scripture. The Prose Edda is not a scripture. It's a Christian version of the old myths. They didn't have any systematic theology. There was no central priesthood. Nobody to enforce an ideology. It seems to have been a highly localized religion. Overall, it probably very much resembled what Snorri wrote about, but there must have been many local variations because in Scandinavia, regional variations, especially in Norway, there was great differences between one area and another because of difficulty of communication. My great-grandfather, who was a cook on a whaling ship, said he could understand the Germans he sailed with sometimes better than the other Norwegians because their languages were so different, even though they were all Norwegians. I'm confident that it must have been the same with the religion. They worshipped differently. One the narrative was inconsistent. One difference you see is Snorri tells us that Odin is the chief god, but a lot of the poetry, a lot of the place names, a lot of personal names, outside sources like Adam of Bremen's history of Hamburg-Bremen diocese, they indicate that Thor was the chief god. So Snorri imposed something on this mass of mythology. Norse mythology was not systematic. Snorri thought like a Christian. And whatever we may think, whatever our neighbors may think, and often we give them reason to think this way, in fact, Christianity is essentially a very organized, rational, thinking, systematic religion. And Snorri took that thinking and he imposed it on the Old Norse religion. Now, the traditional conversion narrative for the country of Norway comes from a book that Snorri also wrote called Heimskringla. Heimskringla, the Circle of the World. And there are other versions, but Snorri's is the best, and it's the best known. It actually gives a national myth for Norway. It's centered on a central character. The biggest saga, the one right in the middle of the book, is the saga of Saint Olaf Haraldsson, whom we'll be talking about. And it's the meta-narrative in Heimskringla is to glorify Saint Olaf. So I'm going to tell you the traditional story as it's generally been understood and remembered, and I'm going to tell you an alternate version, because I think that narrative can be questioned. Now, I'm talking about the conversion of Norway, and my subject is when the Vikings met Christianity. And, Vikings weren't necessarily Norwegian. All the Scandinavians were Vikings, or could be Vikings, or sometimes Vikings. Why Norway? There's a reason why. The reason is Norway has the best stories, because Snorri wrote them down. Snorri and other Icelanders wrote them down. And when I say the best stories, I mean the most violent stories. It's in the saga stories that we get these stories of these crusader kings, the two Olafs, coming in and forcing people to be Christian. And if they were really resistant, they would torture them and maybe even kill them. And this is what the heathens object to. And the purpose of all that was to, I'm jumping ahead. The purpose was to glorify Olaf, and I'll explain that. So that's why I'm going to concentrate on Norway, because this misunderstanding of the conversion of Scandinavia comes from Snorri's wonderful writings and other wonderful Icelandic writings. Great reading. The history may not be so good. So I'm going to concentrate on Norway. A little background, in case your geography is a little fuzzy. Norway is a long, narrow country at the top of Europe. Now, along the coast, that's not what I wanted to do. That's not what I wanted to do. Along the coast of Norway, there is a chain of barrier islands that runs much of the distance north. Merchants from time immemorial have sailed up that coast and kept inside the barrier islands for protection from the weather of the Norwegian Sea. That protected route was called the North Way, and that's where the name Norway comes from. Along that chain, along those islands, along the coast, a series of chieftains set up petty kingdoms, and in those kingdoms they would take toll from the merchants passing by, and they would try to keep the piracy down. That was the beginning of political organization of the country, but it was many kingdoms, as Norway meant nothing but a trade route and a meat region at the time. But the stirrings began in Norway probably after the stirring began in Denmark, the idea of national unification, becoming powerful countries. And what am I doing? I'm going backwards now. And so we get to a fellow known as Harold Fairhair or Harold Finehair sometimes. Harold Finehair, traditionally, some historians doubt that he even existed, but traditionally he is considered the man who began the process of consolidating Norway into a single nation. In 872, or around that year, he won a great victory at a place in Haversfjord, a fjord near present-day Stavanger, Norway, defeated a coalition of his enemies. And interestingly, although he was a heathen, he had diplomatic relations with Christian England, specifically King Athelstan the Great. Why would he do that? Why would Athelstan want an alliance with a heathen Norwegian king? The answer was Denmark. Denmark was raiding England. Denmark wanted to rule Norway, and it was to their mutual benefit to keep the power of Denmark in check. After Harold's death, he was succeeded by his sons. He had about a dozen sons, but the chief among them was Eric Bloodaxe. This lecture will be rich in colorful names. Eric Bloodaxe got his name supposedly because he murdered a couple of his brothers, but he was the chief. He was his father's favorite. And but Harold had a younger son, and he sent that younger son to Athelstan the Great in England. The Whitticks in their book write, and I'll talk about this book more later, they write, Harold Finehair sent his son Håkon to be fostered in England because he realized that Christian ideology would provide support for his new kingship. This is something that I have just realized. I had a kind of a duh moment recently in some of my reading. The fact is, the kings in Scandinavia, kings anywhere in Europe, who wanted a large united kingdom, tended to favor Christianity. They were favorably inclined to Christianity for three main reasons that I can think of off the top of my head. One is respect. Under Christianity, kings were considered God's representative. They liked that. Disobeying them was disobeying God. Secondly, prestige. To become a Christian king was to join the most exclusive club there was, the Christian monarchs of Europe. That was where you made marriage alliances, trade alliances, warfare alliances. That's where business was done at a very high level. You became a player when you became a Christian king. Håkon, and he must have expected that when he sent his son to England, he would be baptized as a Christian, and Håkon was raised as a Christian. He later came to, still as a young man, he came to Norway bringing with him Christian priests, and he expelled his brother Eric. Then, according to the sagas, he faced tension. He was torn between the need to defend the country, which meant he needed the support of the heathen chieftains, or, on the other hand, carrying on his Christian mission. According to the saga, a day came when he had to choose between getting the chief's support for defend against an imminent invasion, or to give up the mission. And according to the saga, he gave up the mission. And one saga even suggests that he died a heathen. More about that later. The sons of Eric Bloodaxe killed Håkon and at the Battle of Fitjar in 961, and they took over. There were several of them. Their leader was Harold Greycloak. And however, according to legend, they were all dominated by their mother, Gunhild, King's mother, who in the sagas is always described as a wanton and a witch, even though they were all baptized Christians. They had been baptized in England. When Eric was kicked out of Norway, he went to England and became the King of York. Being the King of York actually paid better than being the King of Norway. But in order to get the gig, he had to be baptized. So they were all baptized. The sons of Eric were very unpopular. And not especially because they were Christians that we know of, but simply because there was bad weather, bad crops, bad fishing while they were kings. And in those days, the king got the blame for bad years. So they were followed by a fellow named Jarl Håkon. And Jarl is a title. It's equivalent to Earl. And Jarl Håkon was at first subordinate to Denmark because he had assisted the Danes, they had assisted each other in kicking out the Ericssons. But he broke free. His master, King Harold Bluetooth of Denmark, and yes, that is the guy that your wireless device is named after. Harold Bluetooth of Denmark was a Christian. He forced Håkon to be baptized. Håkon was very angry about that, and he led a heathen reaction in Norway and completely pulled independent. He was very popular until the very end of his reign, according to Snorri, and then he became unpopular. Fellow who took advantage of his unpopularity was probably the most romantic Viking king of Norway of them all. That was Olaf Tryggvason. He was a former Viking. He'd been in Russia. Then he raided in England and was probably baptized there. He was baptized under the sponsorship of King Ethelred the Unready, another great king's name. And Ethelred subsidized him when he went to Norway, to be king. He sent more than 20,000 pounds of English silver, according to English records, a tremendous amount that was raised by a special tax. But he thought that with a Christian king in Norway, it would reduce Norwegian raiding and it would divide the attention of Denmark. So he thought it was a good investment. According to the sagas, he carried on an aggressive missionary campaign, sometimes employing torture and violence. He didn't last long. Ethelred's investment did not pay off well. He was killed by a coalition of Danes, Swedes, and the sons of Jarl Håkon at a place called Svold in the Baltic Sea. We don't know where that was. We just have the name. Then Jarl Håkon's sons were installed as tributary rulers to Denmark and Sweden. The Håkon sons, their names were Eric and Svein, divided the rule of North Norway under Sweden and Denmark. And then eventually Eric went off to England to aid his master Canute, the king of Denmark, who was in the process of conquering England. But meanwhile, the southwest of Norway, the south of Norway was ruled directly from Denmark, but the southwest part of Norway, one of the richest parts of the country, was ruled by a fellow named Erling Skjalgsson. He had the title of Herser, which basically means war chief. And he ruled independently, and we'll talk about him some more. After a few years, in 1015, the big man in the saga appears, at least big in Norwegian legend. Olaf Haraldsson. He was also a Viking, a pretty ruthless one. He was probably baptized in Normandy. And he went to England, and initially he fought actually on the side of England against the Danes for Ethelred the Unready. And however, it looks like he changed sides. It's a little hard to understand. The sagas and the records kind of contradict each other, and they contradict themselves, but it looks very much like he went over to Canut's side. Then he sailed for England with 4 ships and a number of priests, and he may have been subsidized by Ethelred in the same way that Olaf Tryggvason had. If so, then he probably double-crossed Canute, because Canute seems to have expected him to go to Norway and be his vassal king, his under-king. Olaf had no intention of being anybody's vassal. He won control of Norway by defeating Erling and the Ericssons at the Battle of Nashar in 1016, and then he proceeded to make full war on heathenism and also on traditional Norwegian government, the democratic system we'll talk about later. He suffered, through the course of his reign, he suffered increasing opposition. Some of that opposition was encouraged by Canute the Great, who by now was king of England, and he bought friends, but he often didn't need to buy friends, because a lot of people were becoming very tired of Olaf. He was driven out of the country in 1028. He spent 2 years in exile in Russia, and then he returned with a small army in 1030. And when I say a small army, I mean a few hundred men. It was not much of an army. It's hard to imagine what he expected to do with this army. It looks like either he was expecting a miracle or he was courting martyrdom. He got martyred. He was killed at the Battle of Stiklestad near Trondheim in August of 1030. And immediately, the legends began. Part of this was because the Norwegians were very disappointed with the government of the Danes. Canute did not keep his promises to the Norwegian chieftains. They were unhappy. But stories were spreading of Olaf's miracles. The picture we have here is a picture of a man called Tor Hund, Tor the dog. He was one of the men who actually physically helped to kill Olaf. He stuck his spear in Olaf. And he told the story that he'd gotten his hand injured in the battle. But when he touched Olaf's blood, it was healed immediately. And he became the greatest proponent of Olaf as a saint. So the legend grew, and in 1035, Olaf's son Magnus, later called the Good, was summoned from Russia, and the Danes were driven out. Now the legend of Saint Olaf was beginning to flower fully. Olaf became the perpetual king of Norway. To this day, the Norwegian kings are consecrated in Nidaros Cathedral in Trondheim, which is where he was buried, and supposedly his bones are still there. They were lost during the Reformation. But the idea is that the kings of Norway received their crowns directly from Olaf, the perpetual king of Norway. So they're kind of his vassals, they're under kings. Olaf became the focal point of Norwegian Christianity, the focal point of Norwegian patriotism. But did he really convert the Norwegians, is the question, the untraditional question that I want to ask. Because there is an alternate narrative, which has been growing in recent years. There were other influences on Norway than missionary kings. One was ancient cultural contacts. From time immemorial, the Scandinavians, who were boating people, seafaring people, had traveled to Germany to trade with their German cousins. They traveled to the Gallic countries. They traveled to England. If you happen to watch a current series on the History Channel, they started out with the idea that the Scandinavians had no idea that English even existed. It was this mysterious place across the sea. That's pure nonsense. You don't have to cross the sea to get to England. You start in Denmark, you follow the coast to Calais, you take a hard right, and you can see the cliffs of Dover on a clear day. It's not rocket navigation. So there was this trade. Any book written about the Vikings since, say, the 1970s is bound to say the Vikings were not only raiders and pirates, they were also merchants. Well, I'll have more to say about that. But they were carrying on trade. The Vikings traveled, whether for warfare or for trade. They got around. They saw what was going on in Christian Europe, and frankly, it was impressive. We may laugh at medieval Europe, but to the Vikings, they had never seen a big church before. They had never seen the kind of art the Christians were producing. They were impressed. Kings were especially impressed because, and I meant to say this earlier, but I'll say it now, I think I didn't finish the list of the things that Viking kings liked. They liked the prestige, they liked the club. Another thing they liked was that Christianity came with a ready-made, prefabricated bureaucracy. The Christian church, you move it in, you got your parishes, you got your dioceses, you got your priests and deacons and bishops, and they're all there, and you can just set them to work keeping tax records and keeping all kinds of records and organizing the country. It was great for a king who wanted to consolidate a political entity. There was a tradition called prime signing. As we mentioned, a lot of the Vikings were merchants, at least some of the time. People who emphasize that usually leave out the part that one of their main cash trade items was human slaves, but they did carry on a lot of trade. The problem was, in Christian countries, Christian merchants weren't allowed to do business with them. So they found a compromise. They would go to a priest. The priest would make the sign of the cross on their forehead, explain a few things to them. That was called prime signing. You were prime signed, you were considered halfway to baptism. And that was good enough so you could do trade. So any Viking who carried on trade in Europe was probably prime signed. So he had some familiarity with Christian faith. There was also the influence of slaves. I mentioned the slaves. A lot of the slaves were taken home for the domestic market to Scandinavia. Many of them were people of good character, and they impressed their masters. And that had an influence too. Now, there's a book. Well, first of all, I'll introduce you to this guy. This is Bishop Fridtjof S. Birkeli. And he was bishop of Stavanger and then Oslo. And he wrote a book. It was collated from his posthumous papers after his death. It was called 12 vintre hadde kristendommen vært i Norge. 12 winters had Christianity been in Norway, in which he wrote about the results of his own research into the conversion of Norway. And he had ideas that did not follow Snorri. He talks about early influences for Christianity in Norway. There's a market called Kaupang in Vestfold County. It was established around the year 780. That's like 200 years before the Olafs showed up. And he writes, finds of Christian cultural objects at Kaupang can hardly be explained as loot from raids. It appears reasonable to assume that there may have been a definite worship life in Kaupang. And he means a Christian worship life. He talks about the Kuli stone. This was a rune stone found in Sunnmøre County in Norway. I think most of you are probably familiar with the runes, at least from Tolkien, the Viking alphabet. The thing about the runes is that they changed over time. And a scholar can identify when the runes were carved by the differences in their forms. When a scholar first set out to translate this stone, he assumed it had been carved in the 900s, the 10th century, because of the forms of the runes. But then he read the inscription and he said, no, I must be wrong. It must be the 11th century. Because the inscription says, Tora and Halvard raised this stone in memory of Ulfjot. 12 winters had Christianity been in Norway. Well, he thought, everybody knows that Christianity came to Norway with St. Olaf in 1015. Therefore, this stone must be dated at 1027. Birkeli looked at that and he said, why not the 10th century? Why not Håkon the Good's time? Was Håkon the Good really a failure? He writes, there are a number of stone crosses that have been found in Norway, especially Western Norway, similar to the British and Irish crosses. Such crosses are not found elsewhere in Scandinavia. This suggests British and Celtic church influence in early Norwegian Christianity. And you know what that means? That means peaceful evangelism. Because that was the strategy of the British church in those days. Be sensitive, do not just come barging in and yelling in people's faces and hitting them. So was Håkon the Good a failure? He writes, the Norway to which Håkon returned from England, as you remember, was by no means entirely unfamiliar with Christianity. The majority of the people were obviously still Norse heathens, but many had been influenced by kinsmen in the West or foreign merchants and merchants at home. It is extremely likely that Håkon received in England a clear impression that Christian missionary work should be carried out without violence. The heathens and their temple should be respected. One ought to proceed with gentleness and charity. There's an early Icelandic book called the Ogrip. It's one of the earliest histories of Norway we have. And in it, it writes, in his, that is Håkon's day, many turned to the Christian faith because he was so well liked. Some gave up sacrificing, even if they did not become Christians. He built churches in Norway and installed learned men in them. He points out that the defeats that Håkon suffers in the sagas mostly took place in the Trondheim region, the Trondelag, and that region stayed heathen for a very long time after other parts of Norway had been converted. So that does not necessarily mean that Håkon failed as a missionary further south. He sees evidence of that in the Gula Thing law. This is the Gula Thingstead. This is a place in southwest Norway where the government of southwest Norway was done at the Gula Thing. And he says if we examine the Gula Thing law, it is reasonable to believe that the observance of Sunday was enacted in the 900s, possibly along with the great holidays Christmas and Easter. It is not unlikely that these first enactments were the work of Håkon the Good and his co-workers. Archaeological excavations that seem to indicate a change in burial practices beginning around the middle of the 10th century leave the strong impression that Håkon's many years of peaceful rule coincided with a peaceful transition from heathen to Christian burial customs. Now, after Håkon, you have this interregnum we talked about before. You have the sons of Eric Bloodaxe, unpopular and Christians and unpopular. Jarl Håkon, who was heathen and popular, but through most of this time, this fellow I mentioned, Erling Skjalgsson, controlled southwest of Norway. Erling was probably already a Christian. He had close family ties to Håkon the Good. When Olaf Tryggvason arrived, Heims Pringla gives the impression that Olaf found southwestern Norway heathen and baptized it. It is in fact more likely that the Vestlanders, like Erling Skjalgsson, were mostly, or at least a large number of them, Christian already. After Olaf Tryggvason's death, northern and eastern Norway were ruled by Denmark, which was Christian, and Sweden, which was in a transitional phase at that time. But Erling Skjalgsson continued to rule the southwest independently, his own way. When Olaf Haraldsson arrives, the sagas imply that Olaf Haraldsson came to a mostly heathen country and proceeded to Christianize it, often by violence. In fact, it's arguable that he came to a country in which the Christians and the heathens were generally living in peace with each other. What Olaf did was he declared war on the heathens. This was in the tradition of his personal hero, Charlemagne, who had carried on similar campaigns against the North German Saxons. It should be remembered that Olaf's crusade, against heathenism was not only against heathenism, it was also against Norway's democratic tradition. In Normandy, he had acquired continental ideas about monarchy. The dukes of Normandy even controlled the church, which was a model he liked very much. All power flowed from the monarch, who got his power from God. In contrast, traditional Norse governance was a very old system called the Thing system. This is democratic assemblies. It has a very long Germanic tradition. If you read the Roman historian Tacitus in his Germania, he describes a similar system of government among the German tribes back in the days of the Roman Empire. There were local things, there were district things, there were regional things. They had both legislative and judicial functions. And this is important. The kings were elected. Nobody could be a king without the approval of the chieftains at the thing. Kings could also be removed if they got too big for their boots. You could boot them out, and that generally meant killing them. Chiefs like Erling Skjalgsson treasured their tradition of democratic representative government. Olaf sought to make them his clients, deriving their power not from the will of the free men, but from him personally. A number of these chieftains, who were Christians, opposed Olaf's political agenda. Erling Skjalgsson, whom I spoke of a couple of times, Erling was killed by Olaf's men in a sea battle in 1028 as Olaf was fleeing the country, as we mentioned earlier. He managed to capture Olaf and massacre his crew, and he claimed that he offered Olaf terms to submit, and that offered Erling terms to submit if he'd be his vassal. And he reported that Olaf said yes, personally, that Erling said yes. Personally, I don't believe that Erling would have done that, even at the point of death, unless he got some kind of a concession from Olaf. But in any case, one of Olaf's men murdered Erling with an axe, and so Olaf had no choice but to run and go into exile. With Erling's support, he might have hoped to rebuild his power base. Without that, there was nothing he could do. When he came back, at the Battle of Stiklestad, and was killed at Stiklestad, traditional story says that this was a battle between Christianity and heathenism. Olaf died as a martyr fighting heathens. In actual fact, Olaf had a number of heathens in his army, and the opposing army had lots of Christians in it. It wasn't that cut and dry. But everything was coming under the legend, the cult of Saint Olaf. After Olaf was canonized, there was great motivation for saga writers to exalt him and to minimize the accomplishments of his predecessors. If Olaf was seen to be the conqueror of the heathens, it was necessary to make Norway look like a completely heathen land. If Olaf's violence was a good thing approved by God, then Håkon the Good's peaceful approach must have been bad and weak. This also covered up Olaf's tyrannies. I had a great moment in my scholarly life when I read a book called Kings and Vikings in the 1980s by P.H. Sawyer. He writes, Erling Skjalgsson and men like him played as important a part in the conversion of Norway as did Olaf. Olaf owed his sanctity to his death, not to his life. And had Christianity not been so deeply rooted, his merits as a saint would not have been so quickly or so widely recognized. A more recent historian, Anders Vinroth, a Swedish historian, wrote a book called The Conversion of Scandinavia, in which he, and I disagree with Vinroth in many points, although I have great respect for his scholarship, but he also argues that the conversion of Scandinavia was largely a peaceful matter. And this was something that I came to realize in my recent reading also, another duh moment. We only have these stories of violence from Norway. Denmark and Sweden seem to have gone fairly easily. And the reason for that, Vinroth explains. He says, and he rejects the sagas. In other words, the saga stories, he says they're worthless, they're pure fiction. I disagree with him on that. But what he sees happening in the historical record is that basically, in that age, when a country was converted, it essentially meant the king was converted. The king became a Christian. He had these, it offered him these benefits we've described. He would see to it that his chief supporters and lords were baptized, and then basically they left the rest of the people alone. There were not, I think a lot of modern heathens imagine something like Monty Python's Spanish Inquisition running around and grabbing everybody and, are you a Christian, and, we'll torture you to death if you're not. That probably happened very rarely, if at all. The conversion was essentially a pro forma matter. You took the king was baptized, you took the country from the heathen column and you moved it over into the Christian column. Done. Box checked. But because of Håkon, I suspect it went deeper in Norway. It may be that later saga writers downplayed Håkon the Good's successes while exaggerating the achievements of the two Olafs. The dramatic narrative made St. Olaf look more heroic and justified his violence, but there's reason to believe that Håkon's the Good's peaceful approach had equal or even greater effect over a long period of time. I recently read a brand new book published in 2018. I recommend it highly. It is, in my opinion, a very high example of Christian scholarship, because these guys are Christians writing for a Christian publisher. And they wrote this book on the conversion of Scandinavia, the Vikings from Odin to Christ. It appears, they write, despite the emphasis put upon the role of Olaf Tryggvason in the written records, his missionary activity consolidated a process which had begun decades earlier under Håkon the Good. So even after the end of Håkon's reign, the English missionaries he probably brought across the North Sea with him continued their work to convert the Norwegian people, as evidenced in the archaeological record. I cannot prove this thesis. It's very difficult to prove anything when we are dealing in that period of history where the documentary evidence is so thin and archaeological evidence is often all we have to go by. But I think you can make a good case that the sagas, which I generally believe contain good history, did a lot of exaggeration about the missionary activities of the Olafs. So what are my conclusions? In the Middle Ages, and even more recent times, Western civilization was very confident that Christianity was a superior religion, at least morally. Even deists and agnostics generally thought, well, yes, I don't believe in Christianity, but it's good, it's morally good. Excesses in force could therefore be justified on the basis of making moral progress. But this rationalization, while understandable, was biblically and morally wrong. In our own time, when the world no longer respects Christianity, it might be useful to re-examine the evidence and rediscover the true spiritual dynamics that plausibly led to the conversion of Scandinavia. Such eternal principles should guide our evangelism today as well. And now, a brief commercial break. The book at the top is a book called Viking Legacy. I'm very proud of it. I did not write it. I translated it for a Norwegian scholar named Torgrim Titlestad, who formerly taught at the University of Stavanger and now is the director of the Saga Heritage Foundation. The two major themes of this book are, one, the importance of the democratic system of Scandinavia, which he believes is more historically influential than it's been given credit for. Also, he defends the historical validity of the sagas, not as inerrant, but as sources which can be used for useful historical information if you use them carefully. The books ranged around the bottom are the four books so far published in my historical fantasy series, the Saga of Erling Skjalgsson. They are all available as ebooks. The West Oversea is also available as a paper book. You can get them from Amazon. Any questions?
Let me come up for a second. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, I will announce a tradition of which I am one of the most ardent violators, which is that a Union student is supposed to have the first question at a Center for Politics and Religion event. I think the first time I said religion and politics. Sean, which is it? Politics and Religion, Center for Politics and Religion. And so we want to allow one of you to ask a question so I can ask a question. So Trinae, if you would go first, thanks.
Question. So you're talking about how the burial practices changed. What were the previous burial practices of the Vikings in Norway as compared to the Christian burial practices?
Burial practices? Oh, good question, good question. That's something I just take for granted, but it's not actually that obvious. The Viking Age archaeology, we see two forms of burial, which vary from place to place and time to time, but basically two. One is inhumation, often in a boat. If it's a chieftain, it might even be in a ship, with grave goods. Inhumation is burial. They would usually under a mound. And if you've ever seen pictures of the Viking ships in the museum in Oslo, the Gokstad and the Oseberg, they were both taken out of burial mounds where they had been preserved in clay. And so the remarkable preservation, you can see what they look like. After the conversion, the church had very clear rules about burial. Christians must be buried in a churchyard in consecrated soil. They could not be buried with grave goods. You could not put, this daddy's sword in there with him. You take nothing to, you come naked and you leave naked. You don't take anything with you to the next world. And so it is very easy for an archaeologist to look at a grave and say, this is a Christian grave, or this is a heathen grave. Yes?
Other questions? Okay. Here we have one over here.
Yes, something I'm curious about is, were there certain aspects or practices within Scandinavian culture which the gospel directly communicated to? Because I believe it was the Celtic Druids of Ireland, if I'm remembering correctly, where they had a practice where they thought to appease their gods, whenever they had a firstborn child, they would sacrifice it to their gods. And then when Christianity came saying, hey, Jesus is the ultimate firstborn sacrifice, that aspect of Christianity directly communicated and helped the gospel spread like wildfire. So I was just curious, is there any practice in Scandinavian culture that is similar or that the gospel directly communicated to?
Interesting question. Did any heathen traditions anticipate the gospel? And that's how the Lord of the Rings came to be, kind of, because he saw Tolkien's and Lewis together. That was Tolkien's and Lewis's famous conversation, which led to Lewis's conversion. The belief that echoes of the gospel were contained in old heathen myths, and that they helped to lead people. There are things that look like that in the Prose Edda, in some of the Viking poetry, often, and Lewis certainly spoke of this. The myth of Balder, for instance, spoke of. Balder is this glorious, beautiful god who is killed in a complex story. But the idea is that he could come back from the dead if everything on earth weeps for him. And in that particular myth, he doesn't. There is one thing that doesn't weep. So Balder stays in hell, which is what the afterlife of the worst afterlife. That's where we get our word hell from, the Norse word hell, with one L. So Balder stays in hell, but after Ragnarok, he comes back and he rises again. And so Lewis had read, a lot of theorists at the time believed that this was a myth that anticipated the Christian gospel. The problem with that is that we're not entirely sure what the original myth of Balder was. This is another example where Snorri reworked the material, and he may have reworked it so extensively that it was that it didn't bear much resemblance to the original. There's another element in a Norse myth where Odin hangs on a tree. I forget if it was 3 days and 3 nights. It was a particular period. No, I think it was more than 3 days. But he hangs on a tree, a sacrifice to himself in order to get the secret of the runes and acquire the magic of the runes. And so some people think that anticipates the crucifixion for the Norse, and that they latched onto that. Again, we're not sure. We're not sure whether Snorri didn't rework that too, because we don't know precisely what the original myth was, or probably an original group of myths. But it's possible that the myths anticipated. I'm not sure of a custom. I don't know of any customs that particularly anticipate the gospel. Something might come to me if I thought a while, but at the moment I can't think of anything like that. Yes?
In Elder King, there's a dialogue about Aryan Christianity.
Yes.
And so, do we know, is there anything known about with Håkon the Good, and I just assumed that it was Orthodox, but I wondered from the book, is
Håkon's mission seems to have been entirely under the guidance of the English Church. When I throw in the most recent book, The Elder King, I throw in some elements relating to the Arian heresy, because there is a legend that there were some people in Norway who actually had been converted to the Arian heresy in the days of the Romans, and brought that back. And I just threw it into the book because I'm not writing history, and I thought it was a cool legend. But no, there's no hint of Arianism in Håkon. Yes?
Talking about the retelling, shaping the story in a Christian way. It's interesting sometimes now, even if Christianity is not affirmed, it shaped our thinking, and sometimes shapes even when non-Christian Westerners think about these stories. I remember you wrote a review of I guess it was the first Thor movie, suggesting that Christianity had shaped their thinking there more than maybe they realized. I thought that was fascinating.
Well, that was the first Thor movie, which I enjoyed immensely. I thought it was interesting that it brought to a scene in the climax where Thor actually has to kneel and sacrifice himself to save other people. And what I said in my review is that's something that's a very Christian idea. That is not something the original Thor that the Vikings worship would ever have done. It wasn't in his nature at all. Even Thor benefits from his encounter with Christianity. Yes?
Could you talk about the conversion of the Icelanders?
The conversion of the Icelanders.
We have the story that they sort of gathered together all in the year 1000, almost in a transaction sort of way.
Yes, and that is another example of peaceful conversion, although it could have gotten violent according to the sagas. According to the sagas, Olaf Tryggvason wanted the Icelanders to be Christian. He was not actually the king of the Icelanders. They were an independent republic operating under a thing system, as they did for many centuries. But he considered himself it his job to send Christianity to the Icelanders. And what he did was he took the Icelandic merchants who were in Trondheim, which was his capital at the time, and he just held them hostage. And he said, I'm not going to let these guys go until you all convert to Christianity. So there's the sagas, in spite of their violence, there's a lot of negotiation that goes on. They were very keen lawyers, and every Viking was his own lawyer. And so there was mediators, and they came and said, look, why don't you let a couple of men go to Iceland? They'll try to persuade the Icelanders to accept Christianity, and we'll get out of this deadlock. So he does. And so a couple of the Icelandic chieftains are sent back to Iceland to convert their neighbors, and they do it in the rational way. They go to the Althing, the national thing of Iceland, and they say, look, we propose that we all become Christians and be baptized and go under Christian law. And of course the heathens didn't like that, and So according to the saga, it came nearly to violence, but then again, these mediators showed up and they said, well, what can we do here? So they agreed, everybody agreed, even the Christians agreed, to let a heathen chieftain, who was the law speaker, the chief officer of the whole thing, to let him mediate. And he sat under a blanket overnight thinking. There's also a rumor somebody bribed him, but he sat thinking under a blanket. And when he came out from under the blanket, he said, this is what we'll do. Everyone had agreed, they had sworn beforehand, we will go by what the mediator says. And he said, we will be baptized, we will have Christian law, but we will retain certain rights for the heathens. They can sacrifice in private. They can expose their children, which is something the heathens did. Unwanted babies were, put out on the mountainside. They can still eat horse meat, which was an issue at the time. If they do it privately, if they don't make an issue, they can still go on and there won't be any law. And the Icelanders accepted that. So, box checked. They're moved over into the column of Christian countries.
All right, I'm going to call into a formal event at this time. So that way anybody who wants to go can go. Thank you all for coming. I'm sure that Lars, dressed in traditional costume, will be willing to entertain a few more questions if anybody wants to stay and ask questions. So, general population released, feel free. And anybody who wants to stay and continue asking questions, feel free to do that as well.